and President and CEO of the International Institute. I'm pleased to be moderating the St. Louis County Library and HEC Media virtual author event with Laila Lalami. She's the best-selling author of the National Book Award nominated novel, The Other Americans, and the recently released memoir, Conditional Citizens on Belonging in America. Before we get started, I'd like to also thank our event independent bookstore partner, Left Bank Books. You can order Laila's book from left-bank.com. Laila, I wish we'd be able to be hosting you in person today at the St. Louis County Library, but thank you for joining us virtually.
Thank you so much for having me.
Wonderful. Today we'll be chatting with Laila about her most recent book, Conditional Citizens on Belonging in America. The book is a series of nonfiction essays arranged by 8 themes: allegiance, faith, borders, assimilation, tribe, caste, inheritance, and last but not least, do not despair of this country. The essays are a fascinating mix of personal anecdotes deftly woven together with historical and current facts. Through them, Laila makes a case that, as she states, there's a shocking difference between the promise of citizenship and the reality. So Laila, let's proceed with a few questions. First of all, why do you use the term conditional citizens? Who are they?
So conditional citizens, as I explain in the book, are people whose access to the rights, liberties, and protections of citizenship is curtailed by accidents of birth, like race or gender or social class or national origin. Within American society, people's access to something as simple and as basic as the right to vote oftentimes is curtailed by, as I mentioned, an accident of birth such as race. Now, this isn't to say that there are laws that say that people of a certain race can't vote, but it is to say that the way in which access to this right is limited has the same effect as if it were a restriction based on race. So for example, with voter ID laws, which disproportionately affect Black people and people of color, or the closure of polling stations, or the fact that there are fewer ballot boxes. All of these are essentially barriers to voting that have the effect that for certain people of particular races, the right to vote is not guaranteed.
Where would there be issues that are uniquely unique to naturalized citizens as opposed to natural-born citizens?
Well, one of the things that naturalized citizens face periodically is this pressure to prove their allegiance to the country through silence and acquiescence, meaning that as long as you have gratitude for America and believe in the national sort of myths of the American dream and hard work and all of that, everything is fine. But if you express dissent with what the government is doing, then you might be told to go back to your country. And we have seen this, for example, with Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who has been repeatedly told to go back to her country because she disagreed with the President of the United States. But one doesn't necessarily need to be naturalized to see that kind of reaction. You also see it with people who are native born. Essentially, citizenship is something that is a kind of coincidence. The fact that a person is born in this country or in another country is what gives them citizenship within this country or that country. And that coincidence ends up giving people access to certain rights or denials of certain rights. So for example, if a person is born in, say, for example, North Korea, they might not have access to freedom of movement, not have the ability to move about out of the country as they please. If they are born in Saudi Arabia, they might not have access to freedom of religion. Or if they are born in Peru, they might not have access to abortion. The opposite of that is if you're born in, for example, a place like Finland, you might have access to social rights like free healthcare. So a lot of what determines our sort of like access to a number of these rights is really an accident of birth. And here in the United States, even though everybody is technically equally protected by the Constitution of the United States, what we in fact see is also a certain amount of curtailing of rights based on accidents of births, as I mentioned.
You spend a sizable part of the book talking about race, in fact, and how race, which is something over which we have no choice, we're simply born that way, how that can affect our lives, both whether we are in fact foreign-born and naturalized citizens, or whether we are native-born. One of the discussions that I found very interesting, I know a little bit about it because of the work I do, but I think many of the audience are not familiar with it, has to do with the question of Middle Easterners and why, in fact, on the racial categories in this country, they end up being listed as white. Mm-hmm. And I think that that would be a discussion that the listeners might be very interested in hearing more about.
Well, I think that the racial categories that exist in the United States on the forms that we all have to fill out when we seek employment or when we apply for different things, there's always a racial component to the forms. And typically there are 4 or 5 or 6 categories. Those categories are specifically designed with American history in mind. So the category of white is defined in a certain way, and the category of Black is defined a certain way, and all of that. And those definitions depend on a combination of national origin, you know, where we trace our ancestry, and also on skin color, on a combination of those things. And the first time I remember when I was a foreign student and I was freshly arrived, and I supported myself by teaching French and Arabic at the University of Southern California. And I had to fill out, you know, a form, and I didn't know. I was very much confused by the categories on offer and really didn't know whether I should check the white box or the Black box or both boxes. I was very confused because Morocco, of course, is where I was born, is in Africa. The categories made mention of Africa, but then it split it into North Africa, which would go with the Caucasian category, and then the rest of Africa was supposed to go under Black. And things are not as simple in real life, because even within Morocco, people who are people identify as either Arab or they identify as Amazigh. It's sort of an ethnic category, and it can go over different kinds of skin colors. You can be Arab and you can be white, but you can be Arab and you can be Black. And what the category basically said is, if you're from North Africa, well, you're going to get put into the white category. And so I was really mystified by that, and it didn't make sense to me until I started to look into the history of how Arabs came to be white. And it just was a very, very interesting history to it in the United States. So originally they were not considered white. The only people who were considered white were people with ancestry in Europe. And of course, whiteness was a condition for access to citizenship. Citizenship was open only to people who were immigrants who were white. So everybody had to petition and make a case to the court, and then the court would decide whether you could become a citizen based on whether you were white or not. And so there are all kinds of cases where people are arguing about whether they should be counted as white or not. So there's a very famous case, for the case of Bhagat Singh Thind, who was actually South Asian, but he made the case that he was Caucasian and he was Aryan and therefore white by any definition of the term, where he was denied because he was Asian. And then in the case of Arabs, some Arabs are close to, trace their ancestry to what is considered Asia, and Asians did not have access to citizenship until there were all kinds of restrictions on Asians for citizenship. And so the court really ended up making decisions based on groups of people. So the earliest Arab immigrants who came in the 19th century, 18th and 19th century, were from Syria and Lebanon. Many of them were Christians, so a lot of them were allowed to become citizens, and therefore the courts decided that they were white. But then when other immigrants started coming from other parts of the Arab world, for example, Yemen, then the court would see the applicant and see that the person was either a dark brown or black, and then deny citizenship. So it was, some people got to become citizens, others as a class were denied citizenship. So Arabs went from being counted as white to being counted as non-white, to again being counted as white by the late 1940s. And so what's interesting about that is that how whiteness was defined was not simply a matter of geographic origin or skin color, but very much also a political decision about what parts of the world got to count as white or not. And so Arabs now, for the moment, are legally considered white, meaning that when you fill the forms, if you put that you are from, even if you put other and you put, Morocco or whatever, you get counted by the census as white. But legal whiteness does not mean the same thing as cultural or social whiteness. So people don't necessarily treat Arabs as white in American society. And we know this because of the way in which, as a class, they are portrayed in a particular way in media. So if you look at popular Hollywood portrayals, it's, as victims or as villains. If you look at how the government even treats Arabs as a class, you see higher levels of surveillance. So there's all kinds of things that apply to Arabs, like, for example, special registration after the 9/11 attacks. Arab men had to register with INS. So there is a certain amount of both government and social behavior that indicates that Arabs are not considered white, even if legally they are considered white. So things get complicated around
they do.
Whiteness and citizenship.
Well, and it's even a greater challenge these days for refugees, for instance, who are arriving in this country, one example, who are from Arab countries, because since they're considered white, for instance, they don't qualify as minority-owned businesses or as disadvantaged businesses, or for any of the other assistance that's in the country, that in fact, because of the discrimination you're just talking about, they feel in some ways even more harshly than other populations and other minorities. And so it's a twisted kind of tangle of weeds there in total. Yeah. Another part of the book I thought was really interesting was your discussion. Well, I thought lots of the book was interesting. Let me say that in advance for the audience that's out there. But another part of the book that I thought was really interesting was your section on borders. When you talked about the Mexican-American border itself and how border was really more than simply the physical border between Mexico and the United States, but that it was much more widespread because of this checkpoint system. And because of it, it really challenged the fragility of the concept of citizenship itself for everyone. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so this was something that I was just really surprised to discover a few years ago. And by far, it is the aspect of sort of the American border system that most surprises my readers when I talk about it. A few years ago, I was traveling to go to a writing residency in Texas, in Marfa, Texas. And on the way there, so after we landed in El Paso, we took a car and we were driving there, and on the Interstate 10, seemingly in the middle of nowhere, we came across a border checkpoint, even though we weren't anywhere near the border. So it's a bit, surprising and potentially even frightening, because there's, dogs and there's armed men in green uniforms. And So they approached our car and they asked us, are you US citizens? And, we said yes. And then we were let go. And it was really interesting because the border agent, or the border patrol agent, essentially has the right to make a determination based on your answer. If the border agent says, are you a US citizen? And you say yes, they can decide that they believe you, in which case you're on your way. Or they can decide based on how you look or how you sound that they don't actually believe you and then they want proof. Now, most of us don't go around carrying birth certificates or passports with us. And so what that means is that the agent can actually pull you aside, demand that you show proof. If you don't have proof, ask that you go get it. I mean, and so each year people actually do get caught that are citizens in these border checkpoints, and they have to go into immigration detention, which is not a place that anybody wants to end up. And so I became curious and I started to look into border checkpoints. And as it turns out, there's a huge network of them. More than 100, anywhere between 100 and 200. And these are placed within 100 miles of land and sea borders in the United States. So all along the border with Mexico, the border with Canada, the oceans, and also the Great Lakes. So 100 miles from all this. And what this means in actuality is that the vast majority of Americans, as many as 200 million, actually live in what is considered the 100-mile border zone. And this is something that grew out of a regulation from 1952 by the Department of Justice that basically allowed Border Patrol the right to look for undocumented people who were crossing the border. It started out at 25 miles, but then it was expanded to 100 miles, which is a massive amount of territory over which that they can set up checkpoints and ask. And so the question then becomes, why is it that the country that is so passionate about personal freedom and liberty has a network of essentially militarized checkpoints, so many of them around the country? And it really goes to this notion of how we police the border. Who gets to come in and who gets to come out, and who has freedom of movement, and who is liable to be asked periodically to show paperwork, even though they are citizens. And a few years ago, there was a survey done near the border in Mexico, and it was found that most of the people that do get pulled aside because they get asked and they get harassed are people who are of Latinos or Latina origin, right? That's who the agents tend to kind of demand to have their paperwork with them. So this is what I mean when I talk about conditional citizenship, which is that your freedom, in this case, the freedom to move about, becomes something that can be taken away from you at any moment because of accidents of birth like national origin. So that's one of the ways in which it's expressed.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. And I remember in the book, it said that within those 100-mile borders, that 100-mile area from the border, 2/3 of the population of the United States is actually located within that period. So it is not an insignificant number of people who were affected by these border checkpoints.
Right, right.
Incredible. I guess one of the other, obviously, because I'm a woman, I was very interested in your section where you talked about gender and about how being female has really also in so many ways makes you a conditional citizen. And you have personal experiences and then also your observations. And could you tell us a little bit about that essay as well?
Yeah. So one of the, I mean, of course, women would fall under this definition of conditional citizenship because, first of all, from the founding of the nation to pretty much almost 1965, women of all racial backgrounds in this country did not have access to many rights, including the right to vote. So yes, the 19th Amendment was passed, but it really only applied to white women. Women of other backgrounds didn't have the right to vote or didn't have access to the vote. And so it really is only with the passing of the Civil Rights Act that they had to vote. So I can't imagine a more obvious sign of conditional citizenship than the fact that you don't have the right to vote. But also women have these the question of our bodily integrity and our the ways in which we move about in the workplace and how whether we are protected by law or not. And in the essay, I talk about the issue of sexual harassment and how it is treated in workplaces. And by the way, this is a global issue, not restricted to the US, but how women are treated in the workplace when there's issues of sexual harassment. Yes, there are systems in place like having human resource departments, but oftentimes what ends up happening is that these human resource departments really are worried about the interests of the company or the interests of the people, the employer, not necessarily the interests of the employee. And I connect this really to how women have a really hard time being believed when they report sexual harassment. And this can happen not just in the workplace, but also in the political arena. And we've seen this with the confirmation hearings of Brett Kavanaugh, where Christine Blasey Ford brought her case essentially to the nation. And we all know how that ended up, with Kavanaugh being confirmed to a lifetime seat on the court. And so I think that just in general, citizens who are women just have a more difficult time proving their cases of sexual harassment, which makes it so much harder to deal with the issue.
Yeah, absolutely. You completed this book prior to the killings this spring of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others, which resulted in the reemergence of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I was wondering as I read the book, you know, and if you were completing it now, would there be anything additional that you would want to say or add to your essays, your book in essence?
That's a really good question. So there is a chapter in which I talk about race and how access to certain rights is not equal depending on race. And I talk a lot about voting, but I also talk about how encounters between a citizen and agents of the state is something that ordinarily is supposed to be anonymous. You're all supposed to be treated the same, but in reality, it is something where race can play a huge part and it can lead to violence. So just being pulled aside for a routine traffic check, that is more likely to end up in violence if the person is African American. So this was something that I very much was including in the book, but I didn't have a huge section on it, but it was included in the book. If the book had been published now, of course, it would be something that I would write about at greater length, because of the fact that there is this sort of movement that we're now seeing, this reinvigoration of the movement. I think this is one of the issues of writing books, is that they are written within the perspective of their time, and that when events change, then of course you change, and then the book also changes. Racism has been a part of US history, and racist violence at the hands of police has also been part of US history. It is something that I gesture to in the book and I include in the book, even if it doesn't specifically mention George Floyd or Breonna Taylor. I think one of the things too that happened after the book was published is the fact that the COVID pandemic erupted, and a number of these sort of like faults in American society or sort of fault lines in American societies actually deepened and make the case for some of what I talk about in the book. So I think it often happens that when you write something, that events can sometimes overtake it. Yeah.
Absolutely. You've raised some really tough issues in these essays, and are there steps that you might suggest that our viewers take if they want to be able to begin the changes that are so important, and some of which you highlight in your book?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is what the final chapter is about. I knew that in talking about all the ways in which the citizenship is not experienced in equal measure by all of us, You know, it doesn't protect all of us equally, but there are things that each of us can take in order to make it a more equal system. Part of the reason why it's unequal is that it started out in a way that was unequal at the founding of the nation, right? Because citizenship was restricted to free white persons. And even though it has been reformed slowly over a period of 200 years, some of these inequities are still existent in the system. And one of the things that we can do is to find out what it is about each of us, like what is our special talent, and connect that to the fight for justice. One of the things that is possible to do is to help people regain their voting rights. In the United States, as many as 2.3 million at any one time are incarcerated and end up losing their voting rights, and even when they've served their time. Now in Florida, the voters of Florida decided to restore voting rights to people through Amendment 4, I believe it was called. And this was such a wonderful, development, and it's widening access of voting rights. But the legislature ended up imposing essentially the equivalent of a poll tax, or basically required these people to repay court costs, and wouldn't tell them how much the court costs were, by the way. But anyway, so the point is that one of the things that we can do is, donate to the fund to help pay people's court costs so that they can be, so that they regain voting rights. And that's a form of activism, basically helping someone regain their rights. Another thing that one can take, it just depends on what your special talent is. If you are somebody who has special teaching talents, one of the biggest problems in the country is unequal outcomes in schools. And this has to do oftentimes with social class, because parents who have jobs that enable them to have one parent at home, or even if it's two parents, but they have more free time, they're able to help their kids after school, they're able to help them with homework and provide tutoring, or they're able to even do things like enrolling their kids in preschool, which is so important for childhood development. Not everybody has that. And so if you have the kind of talent where you can help kids, especially in the early years, which is when a lot of that delay starts taking place, that can be a fantastic way of helping young people become the kind of equal citizens we want them to be. So it just depends what a person's talent is. I was talking earlier today to somebody who was canvassing to help register people to vote. There's just so much that people can do, and it really has to do with your special talent, how much time you have, and how much you want to be involved.
Could you share a little with the audience about your own story and why you felt compelled at this point in your life to write Conditional Citizens?
Yeah, so I started thinking about this book in July 2016. I was watching the Democratic National Convention, and a couple from Virginia came to speak on behalf of the nominee, the Democratic nominee, and they eulogized their son, who was a captain in the United States Army, who had died in combat, or rather he had died trying to save his fellow soldiers from a terrorist attack. And they also were essentially castigating the Republican nominee for his Muslim ban. And it was such an electrifying moment when Mr. Khan pulled out his pocket copy of the Constitution. But the week later, surrogates for the Trump campaign were attacking him as basically as somebody who was a stooge for the Muslim Brotherhood. They said that he wasn't letting his wife speak. They even implied that maybe his son had been a stealth jihadist. I mean, it was very, very ugly. And so I wrote a column for The Nation magazine. I'm a regular contributor there, and I wrote a column called Conditional Citizens. And it's basically talking about this dynamic for naturalized people, but also more broadly for people of color, where you are expected to show your allegiance. And if you don't show gratitude and allegiance, but instead have dissent or disagreement, then there's a lot of like ugliness that comes out of that. You can see it, you don't have to be an immigrant. You can see it even with, for example, football players or basketball players who speak out in favor of racial justice and are told that they should be grateful because they're multimillionaires and they shouldn't spend their time advocating for causes that they believe in. So it's kind of the same dynamic. And so I wrote that column, but at the time I was working on my novel, The Other Americans. And when I was done with the novel, I decided that I would sort of expand this on this idea of conditional citizenship and kind of like broaden it and think about it from multiple different lenses. It was also coming up on the 20th anniversary of my oath of citizenship, which I took at the Pomona Fairplex in 2000. And it seemed like a nice round number and a good way to look back on 20 years and to see what I have learned over the course of 20 years about citizenship, both from my own experience, but also from observing how it was lived and by other people around me. And one of the things that I noticed is how much everything that I've noticed or experienced also connects me to the experiences of others. So for example, this idea that people of color have to show allegiance, and if they don't, that somehow they are traitors. And I write about this in the book in the first chapter. This is something that Japanese Americans went through during the Second World War, where basically they were forced to give up their properties, their lands, their homes, and they were put on trains and sent to internment camps. And they were essentially surveilled by their own government and treated as traitors within their own country. In fact, the place in which I was sworn in, the Pomona Fairplex, I discovered a few years later, served as an assembly center for Japanese Americans. And that was where Japanese Americans in Southern California had to report before they were sent into concentration camps. And I remember when I discovered that fact, I was, floored by the idea that the government was swearing in new citizens at the site in which people were essentially being treated as non-citizens, as foreigners, and as traitors. So there was something about that connection that really made me realize how all of the rights that we have as citizens are really tethered to the rights and well-being of other citizens around us. And so that's why the book looks at things like race and gender and national origins, starting with my experience, but really connecting me to the experiences of others.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. Thank you. Any thoughts about what your next book or project might be?
Not yet. And I always hesitate to talk about things when I'm still kind of thinking about them. To be honest, I've just been so distracted by the COVID pandemic because, this book was supposed to come out in April and then it got pushed to September. So I'm still doing tour events for it. And of course, with the election coverage, I'm constantly checking my phone for recent updates. So I just haven't been able to really work in earnest on the next thing. I mean, I have ideas, but I haven't yet begun writing.
I will look forward to it because it'll be another great revelation, for myself personally and for the community at large.
Thank you so much.
So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.